Welcome to the Tanya Acker Show. Jake Auchincloss is the United States Representative for Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District, and he's here with me today to talk about the government shutdown. Because as I sit here today, the government is shut down. What that means for people, how long it's likely to last, how you break an impasse when things are as bitterly divided as they are a few things that Jake and I talk about. And he also has suggested that the Democrats are bereft of big ideas. He has some new ones that we'll also talk about on the show. So thank you so much for being here. And please don't forget to subscribe. Here I am with Representative Jake Auchincloss. Thank you so much, Representative Auchincloss, for being here, especially right now as our country is shut down. I appreciate your making the time.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's just cut to the chase and talk about the shutdown, which is front of mind for so many people. The GOP has argued that the Democrats are responsible because your party wants to provide health care for undocumented people. This has already been fact-checked and been proven not to be true. Would you like to explain why it's not true?
Yes. Federal Medicaid dollars cannot be used for undocumented individuals in the United States. Period. Full stop. I am on the Health Subcommittee in Congress. We spent 27 hours debating with Republicans during their one big beautiful bill that gutted Medicaid in order to pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% in this country. And every single time that we pressed them on the wisdom of pulling healthcare away from 10 million individuals, on the wisdom of surging emergency room visits for Americans, on the wisdom of gutting funding for long-term care and community healthcare centers, their only response was immigration. They have just been programmed that whenever they get into a tight spot on policy, just blame immigrants for it. And it's not going to work because the American people aren't foolish and they can see through those talking points and they can see that they are being asked to pay more for health care so that the very richest can pay less in taxes.
The American people are not foolish, but the American people are now, by and large, consumers of the most partisan media that we've probably seen since the days of way before you and I were alive, where, every little county had a paper. Right now, it's not, there are fewer players, but those players are able to cater only to folks who've already fallen in line with what the sort of political theory of the place is. I'm just trying to be so polite about all of this.
Sure.
So a lot of people may not be foolish, but they may only be hearing and reading and seeing that the reason that the government's shut down is because your party wants to provide healthcare to illegals. It's not true, but the falsity of it may never be reported. So how do we get past this kind of impasse?
First,
well, before I say that, it may not be reported on some platforms. The truth of it may not be reported on some platforms. On others, certainly it is. So with that, sorry to interrupt you.
Not at all. First, we need to go everywhere and talk to everyone. So my day started at 5 a.m. because I was on Fox, their morning show. And I was talking to them about exactly this. And they asked me about exactly this. They showed a clip of Speaker Mike Johnson talking about healthcare for undocumented immigrants. And I corrected the record. Now, am I going to persuade 100% of Fox viewers? No. But if you look at the demographics of Fox viewership, actually about half of their viewers are persuadable. Half of them are hardcore MAGA, but half are persuadable. And if we can reach some of those persuadable voters by contesting the falsities, we are doing half the job. The other thing that we have to do, and what you are doing right now, is we've got to create our own media ecosystem too, as well as Democrats. And what I find so exciting about your show and about shows like this is Democrats too often think that we win political campaigns by going to political places and talking about policy only. And what Republicans have understood better than we have is that you win political campaigns upstream by talking about culture and by being part of a cultural milieu that makes people understand that you share their values. And we as Democrats have to do a much better job of long-form communication in not just political spaces, but in cultural spaces as well.
I know that you are, and thank you for the shout out, by the way. I know that you are a part of a movement to create sort of a different type, or to build consensus around different lines. You are the chair of Majority Democrats, capital M, capital D. What is Majority Democrats and who's in it?
32 young Democratic leaders, members of Congress, mayors, governors to be. We are the vanguard of a new Democratic Party. We're trying to define a new center because our politics is realigning. And a realigned electorate means an opportunity to define what the terms of debate are. And if we get stuck in a static debate, in an old debate about left versus right, left versus center, we are going to lose. What we have to do is define a new center by taking the best ideas from various ideological factions. From constitutional conservatives, take their respect for faith, family, and the flag. From libertarians, their skepticism of centralized and personalized power. From progressives, their dedication to investing in a level playing field and equal opportunity for everybody. From populists, their concern with the status quo and their crusades against corruption. We can beg and borrow the best ideas from across this country and then use them to define a new center that the exhausted majority in this country can rally around. If we do not do this, if we allow the status quo for the Democratic Party to persist, we will lose elections. And MAGA is going to craft for itself a permanent majority, or at least a generational majority.
The realignment has happened before because there were some allies that were allies back in the day that you wouldn't even imagine being at the same table. I learned recently that a lot of our environmental protections were spurred on by hunters because they wanted to protect natural spaces. So certainly that type of realignment is possible. What I pose to you is, how does it happen in this age of fractured media?
It takes three things. It takes ideas, it takes talent, and it takes courage. So we need talented leaders, elected leaders, to not just campaign on, but more importantly, govern on compelling ideas, big ideas, disruptive ideas. I'll give you some examples. One, I think there is a growing cultural fault line about digital dopamine on one side, the attention fracking of social media corporations and online gambling firms, and an economy of in real life effort on the other side, on the authenticity and dignity of human connection in person. And Democrats should wage that fight. We should get on the right side of that cultural fault line. After decades spent on our heels, engaging on cultural issues where we feel like we're on the losing side in a bad faith way, we should try to define and own and win on this issue. But it requires us taking on these social media corporations in a way that neither party has been willing to do to date.
I read an interview with you, I think it was in Time magazine, where you describe what you believe went wrong with the Democrats. And it really kind of dovetails, I guess, where you think things started really sort of dovetails with some of the things that you're working on now, because you suggest that it all began with school closures and kids weren't learning. Their unengaged brains became too vulnerable to these social media manipulations. Can you just describe in better terms that path that you talked about?
Absolutely. So I'm not sure I would say it sort of began there, but I think that episode encapsulates how the Democratic Party has lost its way. In 2020, Dr. Ashish Jha, who went on to become Biden's COVID coordinator, said that the schools should and indeed must reopen. Socially, epidemiologically, by May of 2020, it was time for the schools to reopen. Well, in too many blue cities and blue states, it was another year and a half before they were fully reopened. And that was because Democrats became fixated on process, particularly process that catered to various interest groups, instead of focused on the outcomes that actually mattered to families, which was get my kids into the classroom. They need to learn. And worse than that, I think, candidly, Democrats oftentimes came across as condescending as parents expressed their frustration watching their kids miss out on once-in-a-lifetime learning and social opportunities. And that mixture of a focus on process rather than outcomes, paired with condescension, has been the undoing of our party. And we need to first own it. We need to apologize for it. And then we need to tell people how we're going to fix it. We're going to surge one-on-one high-dosage tutoring to every student in America, reading, writing, arithmetic, first grade through eighth grade. And we're going to build 1,000 trade schools to give the kids the in real life skills they need to succeed in this economy. And we're going to make the social media corporations pay for every dime of it. They've been treating our children like products. Now they're going to pay.
How are you going to make them pay?
A tax on their digital advertising revenue.
What is the theory behind that tax? What's the theory behind the tax?
There's an old saying in the tech world that if you're not paying, you're the product, right? So we all use Meta or Instagram, TikTok, whatever. It's free, right? It's not free. What they are doing is monetizing your attention span and selling it off to advertisers. And indeed, they're incredibly sophisticated about how they securitize the attention span, particularly of very valuable consumer demographics, which tends to be adolescent men and women. So what they have done is they are fracking the attention span of our young people. They're warping their sense of self and society, and they are totally unaccountable for it. So my view is, given that these companies pay no taxes anyway, because they all have all these shell games to avoid income tax, we should just directly tax their digital advertising revenue, which is basically the sum total of all the monetization of the attention spans that they are conducting, and then direct those funds to healing what they are breaking, which is to say by sending those funds towards education of our children.
Describe what you think the problem is with the AI chatbots and the algorithms that are specifically designed to better engage young people. I don't mean for the better, but I mean just to keep them engaged and keep them in front of their computers. And I'm also going to throw this out at you. What about that age-old argument that's been made since way before you and I were born, that it's really up to the families to regulate social media? I mean, and in truth, I know lots of parents, in fact, who regulate social media time, who take it upon themselves to impose certain types of controls. So answer the question that you know you're going to get, which is, why is this the government's responsibility? Or business, rather?
It isn't solely the government's responsibility. Parents absolutely should be in the driver's seat. And indeed, one of the pieces of legislation I'm working on is putting parents in the driver's seat for verifiable age signals for their children using Apple or Google phones so that apps know what age their children are. But the parents are the ones deciding that age gating, because it absolutely is parents who need to be the primary custodians of their children's well-being. But parents need help. And they're up against trillion-dollar corporations that have hundreds of thousands of software engineers whose only job it is to keep their kids glued to the screen so they can make more money. It'd be like if you were trying to buy a bicycle helmet for your kid, and there were some bicycle helmets on the shelf that worked really well and had the Consumer Product Safety Commission seal of approval, and others that would absolutely fail in the event of an accident, but also had the Consumer Product Safety Commission seal of approval. That's not fair to parents. I mean, yes, it's parents' jobs to buy their kids a bicycle helmet, but it's also their job to make sure they're getting the right information at the right time and the right regulatory support, and we are not providing that for them. I think, and you know this better than I do, given your work in the legal system, society does have a compelling interest in protecting the developing brain. We treat children differently in the legal system. We treat children differently in terms of privacy and in terms of criminal justice, because we know that their dopamine systems, their prefrontal cortices, their general brain development is immature. And the problem is that these social media corporations are taking advantage of that. And the online gambling firms and the pornography firms are taking advantage of that and really warping young people's mental health and sense of self-esteem. That's not a point of view. That's not an opinion. We have hard data that since 2012, when smartphones really started to become ubiquitous, there has been a plummeting of mental health for both young men and young women.
The data often can really change the day. I'm sure you know this story. I think it was back in the early 20th century when our food wasn't regulated. Like you could just put deodorized lard out in the grocery store shelves, and they did, and color it yellow and call it butter, or like pick up, like have rat droppings mixed with the sausage pieces. And first everybody was like, government shouldn't be regulating, what people do. I can handle my own, people can handle their own dinner table. When it was discovered that they were ingesting deodorized lard, they said, maybe those labels might not be so bad. And so thank you for pointing out how important it is to actually pay attention to the data. I want to move on to the current administration's use of force in this country. I know you served in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for your service. And you actually trained at the same base that was used to deploy Marines to my hometown of Los Angeles. What are your views on this use of our military? You yourself having been in action. And I just want to reiterate that. And thank you again, because I find it astonishing the number of people who pontificate about military service and what it means, and who never put on the uniform. I didn't put on the uniform. I simply respect it. So thank you again. And talk about this deployment, if you would.
It's the most dangerous thing happening in America today is the confluence of an abuse of executive power alongside the politicization of the military. Those two things together and their combination is the most dangerous thing happening in America. We saw in President Trump's first term that it took people like Mark Milley and other very senior officers to demonstrate some backbone when he wanted to deploy the military in violation of posse comitatus and in furtherance of his own ends, political ends. They wouldn't do it. He's trying to weaken those antibodies now. He's trying to degrade that nonpartisan posture of the military ahead of time. And we need to fight back against it ferociously, which is why the protests when he deployed the Marines to Los Angeles were so important, because they worked. I think they really actually depleted his political capital with those No King's Days protests. And we need to sustain that pressure. It's not fair to American citizens, of course. It's also, though, not fair to those Marines and to those National Guardsmen, because that's not what they signed up for. Okay, they signed up for combat against America's enemies, whether Vladimir Putin or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They signed up to help in cases of natural disaster. They did not sign up to police fellow American citizens.
Do you have a sense amongst the rank and file about their feelings toward it? Because, obviously they got to do as they're ordered to do, not their decision about where it is they're deployed. But are you kind of, do you maintain contact with the rank and file, or do you have some special channels since you yourself served?
I'm not sure I can speak to individual sentiment. What I can say, though, with a lot of confidence is that this is terrible to good order and discipline and esprit de corps within the ranks. Mm-hmm. What has made the American military special ever since George Washington handed over his sword to the Continental Congress 250 years ago, what has made it special is that it swears an oath to the Constitution, not to an individual. Yes, military officers are bound to obey all lawful orders from superior officers, lawful, but they swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. And I remind every single young man and woman that I nominate to a military academy of that when I speak to them, because it's vital. It's really what differentiates us. And to the extent that he's in front of these troops and, pitching MAGA hats and complaining about Democrats and going on these long tirades about whatever it is he talks about, it just undermines that esprit de corps and that good order and discipline. And it's going to take us a generation to fix it.
You've also said that the Democrats are bereft of big ideas, and you have proposed a few. One of those was to get rid of the primary system. Doesn't that get a little messy? Because then you've got elections where you may never even have a majority, because you have like all kinds of people running. And I say this as a Californian, we always have all kinds of people running. What's the advantage of eradicating the primary system?
Absolutely. And I talk about these big ideas weekly on my Substack, Simple But Not Easy, because I think it's important.
I know, I subscribe.
Oh, thank you. I think our party needs to start telling people what we are for, not just who we are against. It's been a decade, and we have to have our own big ideas. Let's talk about the primary system, though. You're from Los Angeles, so actually you are very familiar with the alternative that I think is important, which is a top two system. That's how California actually does its governor's race and its delegation races. Let's just give our listeners, though, a thought exercise. Imagine that every single American walked into a college football stadium. It was an infinitely big stadium. And we gave them a survey, an ideological survey, a 13-point survey that political scientists use, meant to roughly assign them where they are from left to right. If every single American took that survey and they filed in to the college football stadium and they went to the yard line that aligned with roughly where they were on that scale, about 70% of Americans would be between the 40-yard lines. Now, our listeners may find that surprising because if you look at social media or cable news, you would think that we are inherently polarized. The truth is actually, if you look at the public opinion data, even on hot button issues like guns and immigration and abortion, about 2/3 of Americans between the 40-yard lines. What we are, though, is very tribal. And one of the reasons we are very tribal is of the 435 members of Congress, only about 20 actually compete for those 2/3 of voters within the 40-yard lines. Everybody else has to compete to the flanks. Because what the primary system does is it turns out very ideologically intense, skewed voters in low turnout elections. And when that happens, you have people who are way too oriented towards the 20-yard lines. And it creates a skewed perspective of where American politics actually is. So a good solution would be to say, hey, every candidate is on the same ballot, and every voter can participate in every taxpayer-funded election. So there's a preliminary election, everybody's on the ballot, the top two advance to November, everybody can vote, and the winner wins with the majority. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, especially when you think about how it can combat the tribalism that you talked about.
If you make everything competitive, if there's districts that are fairly drawn, if you try to keep the big money, the really big money out of it, and if you let every voter participate in every election, competition really works. It really does drive things towards a fairly reasonable place politically. We've just deprived ourselves of political competition in most spheres of our elections, and it's to the detriment of the American voter. It has real world impact every day. I'll give you one example, which is gun safety issues. Probably 2/3 of Americans support background checks. Similar amount support red flag laws. I'm sure you're familiar with both. And the problem is Republicans can't vote for those issues. They're popular in their districts. They can't vote for them because their primary voters will unseat them in low turnout primary elections.
Another big idea that you proposed was reforming land use laws and making it easier to build. Talk about why you think that's important and how you balance that with what some in your party would prioritize as environmental and conservation issues.
Yeah, I don't think they're in tension. And in fact, I think they're complementary. The biggest line item in a family's budget today is rent or mortgage payments. 30 to 60% of their take-home pay is going towards home ownership or renting, depending on where they live. And it is much worse for millennials than it was for baby boomers. And it's going to be even worse for the alpha generation if we don't do anything. The way to solve that is to expand the supply of housing. And in particular, we need more 2 to 20 unit apartments. Those are the workhorses of affordability. We used to build a lot of that. Starting in the 1920s and 30s, zoning made it almost impossible to build it in most places. In Massachusetts, for example, about 99% of land is prohibited for a 6-unit apartment building. When you block off 99% of land for 6-unit apartment buildings, what you're doing is functionally making it so that unless you can afford a big single-family home with a 2-car garage, you just can't afford a house, period. And that ends up cascading costs across the entire middle class. So my proposal is we've got to build at least 5 million homes over the next decade. And to do so requires land use and zoning reforms at the state and local level, but it also requires bold federal action. We should build new cities. Americans used to build cities all the time. Every time we bumped into a river, we would build a city as a country. We stopped doing it ever since World War II. We should do it again, particularly on decommissioned military bases that already have the infrastructure necessary.
Well, and also think about all of the cities or parts of cities that were raised or neglected as part of the federal highway project. You know, my friend and law school classmate, Deborah Archer, wrote a book, Dividing Lines, How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. I mean, there were vibrant towns in some parts of the country before they were partitioned by freeways. I mean, there's so much opportunity there. There's so much opportunity. And that seems like a really practical thing that everybody could get around, right? Like if you're a developer, or if you're somebody and if you're someone who's in need of affordable housing. So that seems like something that the Democrats should be running to the bank with between now and the midterms. How much traction are you getting on these ideas?
The pro-housing movement at the local level, the YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard, I would actually argue is the most successful grassroots Democratic movement in the last decade. And in some sense has been a template for a lot of other Democratic policies that are emerging around energy policy. For example, we want to build more clean energy infrastructure, around healthcare policy and expanding the supply of healthcare through community health centers and nurse practitioners. It's a similar concept of if you want to lower costs for the most important social goods that the middle class needs, housing, healthcare, utilities, you've got to do three things. You've got to, one, unlock production. You've got to build more of that thing. Two, you've got to take on special interests that are keeping prices artificially high. And we see this in healthcare all the time. And then number three, you've got to aggressively adopt technology where it can help automation and help take out cost. You know, you and I were talking at the beginning of this podcast about tech, and people might get the perception I'm very anti-tech. I'm not. I think tech is fantastic. We should be using it everywhere we can to make things cheaper, better, faster. But it has to be in furtherance of things that help people, not taking advantage of 14-year-olds.
Speaking of what most Americans need, let's circle back to where we are right now, the shutdown government, because I would suggest that most Americans need a functioning government. I would just say as a baseline, we would all like that. Can you talk a little bit about what this shutdown means for real Americans and just everyday terms? We can talk about not, you know, there's a theory about this program, there's a theory about that program. What does this shutdown mean just as a practical matter?
You know, in the first couple of days, I think most Americans don't really see it or feel it. The shutdown, though, it accumulates impact. It's the national parks, it's constituent services and casework around the IRS or Medicare or Medicaid, it's airports and screenings, it's passports. And eventually, every American intersects with a federal service. And what they're going to find is a brick wall. And then at an even more core level, you know, a functioning federal government is part and parcel of a healthy economy, right? There's a ton of regulations, there's a ton of investments and infrastructure, and you're going to start to see what is already a very soft economy, and the jobs numbers are not good, and the inflation numbers are not good. You're going to see that economy soften at a much faster pace because a lack of confidence in the federal government is going to bleed over into a lack of confidence in the economy.
How do you see this ending? I know that's probably calls for a whole lot of speculation, but have at it. Because as I see it, if both sides aren't even playing by the same set of rules, right, and acknowledging facts in the same way, how do you get past an impasse? I'm not sure what that looks like. So what do you think that looks like?
I think the American people are the referee here. I think as public opinion starts to crystallize on who is to blame, I think that side is the one that is going to have to throw in the towel. And the thing about this fight right now is the American people agree with Democrats that healthcare is important. And they understand our core point that the middle class is who funds the government. And if the middle class is being asked to fund the government, then it's reasonable for the middle class to ask the government, what is the government doing for them to help lower their cost of living, which is the single biggest complaint we hear from Americans every which way we ask. When you take billions out of Medicaid, what you are doing is you are raising costs for long-term care, you are raising costs for primary care, you are raising costs for elder care, and that's not an acceptable answer to the middle class. So I think that we are going to get the referee on our side on this shutdown fight, but we have to be crystal clear about what we are fighting for, and the answer is we're fighting for healthcare.
I think it's well known that there have been plenty of people in the GOP who have wanted to change the face and character of the American government for a long time. I mean, you could throw it out to people in both parties. A lot of people, a lot of Democrats believe that the federal government is too big and too bloated. So assume that to be true. Also assume that there are some who said, we want to radically and dramatically change what federal government looks like. So in order to do that, we may have to take some pain and some blows, but we are on track to get what we want. Because isn't it true that there's some discussion about whether or not some of these firings and closings or enclosures may become permanent?
Yes. I don't think Democrats are flinching right now on Donald Trump's threats or follow-throughs on firing the federal workforce, because candidly, he was doing that anyway. Russ Vogt was going to do this regardless, just like they were going to do the rescissions to peel back money regardless of what had been appropriated. The problem with the madman theory of negotiating, and Donald Trump loves to lean in on this theory of, you don't know what I'm going to do. I'm hard to negotiate with because I'm just so crazy I'll do anything. The problem with that game theory is that at a certain point, your counterparty starts to say, well, if you're just going to be crazy regardless, then it's really not a good use of our time to take you seriously. And that's kind of where Donald Trump has painted himself into a corner too. And frankly, not just with Democrats, but with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Israelis and the Qataris as well. As a lot of counterparties to Donald Trump take him less and less seriously because he keeps on brandishing these threats and this bravado and failing to follow through. And so I think where Democrats are focused on right now is not what Donald Trump is going to do, but what the middle class believes about the role of the federal government in their lives. You are absolutely right. A lot of people think it's too big and bloated and inefficient. And candidly, a lot of times the government is too inefficient. And Democrats should not be reflexively defensive of the status quo. We should totally make things more cost effective. And we shouldn't be just, running to the nearest government building to protest every time someone wants to do something around efficiencies. Like, no, we got to, think this differently and disruptively. But we're not going to do so just to, out of this act of performative cruelty. We're going to have a plan for how we're actually going to deliver services more cost effectively.
Is there an end in sight? Are you optimistic as we sit here now?
Yes, I do think there's an end in sight. I am not in the Senate huddles, so I'm not going to predict when and how that is. But I think as public opinion crystallizes, I think you'll see this come to an end.
Jake, and you told me I could call you that, so thank you. I'm going to take another opportunity to thank you for your service to our country. And also thank you for taking the time on what is certainly a very busy day. I'll let you go back to work. Thanks so much for being here.
Such a pleasure to be on. Be well.